Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and I'm finally gonna address the elephant in the room. Now, growing up in the 90s, when I was a kid, I grew up in what many people would probably consider to be a hood neighborhood. And by hood, I mean bad neighborhood. By hood, I mean low income, gangster, you name it, right? That's the type of neighborhood I grew up in. And I remember when I was a kid, it seemed like a lot of the kids that grew up in the hood had Sega Genesis. A lot of us grew up playing Streets of Rage, Mortal Kombat with the blood, and a lot more of those edgy games. And even Sonic. For a mascot, even Sonic was more edgy. When you think about a mascot, he was way more edgy than Super Mario. Super Mario, for some reason, just seemed like he never had a care in the world. Even though he had this massive fire-breathing turtle trying to steal his girl and burn him to a crisp, Mario always had this smile on his face. Whereas Sonic, Sonic had attitude. Sonic was impatient. If you didn't move Sonic enough in the game, he would tap his foot and cross his arms and look at you like, what are you waiting for? So Sega Genesis always had this edge to it, even in the campaigns, even in the marketing. The way they marketed Sega Genesis just had a whole completely different vibe. And I felt like it catered to more to that hood culture than Super Nintendo. Now, even for my family, I had family that lived in different parts of New York, all over New York, all over the 5 boroughs. And even for my family that lived in the hood, even they had Sega Genesis. But when it came to the Super Nintendo, what I noticed was that my friends who were more privileged, whose parents had probably better financial status, they would tend to have a Super Nintendo, actually. And I noticed that if I went to a friend's house who lived in a nice neighborhood, who lived in a nice area, when they said, hey, do you want to play games? Do you want to play video games? They would say, and I said, yeah. The first thing that they'd be pulling out is either a Super Nintendo or a Game Boy. And it was just one of the things that I noticed. And so I gotta ask the channel, did you notice that as well? Do you feel like growing up, and this question is probably going to be more aimed at the folks who grew up in the 90s, or at least who grew up if you grew up anywhere between the 80s and the early 90s and mid 90s, let me know down in the comments. Did you notice that trend that Sega was more of a hood console and the Super Nintendo was more of a preppy console? Now, don't get me wrong. We had Super Nintendo as well, because as early as I can remember, we started off with a Nintendo. But by the time I got old enough to actually understand what video games were, we had traded it in for a Sega Genesis. And we had the Sega Genesis so long that we had at least 15 games for the Sega Genesis. And back then, that was a lot of games to have for one console. But that was how much we played the Sega Genesis. But at one point, I remember coming home from school, and when I came home, the Sega Genesis was gone, and all the games were gone. And I remember distinctly like sinking into a sad state of depression, because it was like, dude, where are the video games? Where did they go? And I remember like that afternoon, my brother coming home with a Super Nintendo, and he had basically traded away all of the games, all of his Sega Genesis games, along with the console and the controllers, to get a Super Nintendo. And we didn't even have the Super Nintendo that long. We didn't have many games for it. Final Fight, Axlay, I think we had Super Mario World for a little bit of time, a few games for the system. But we didn't keep the Super Nintendo long, because not much longer after we got it, my brother wound up trading it in for a Sony PlayStation. But we definitely had the Sega Genesis longer, and we definitely played the Sega Genesis a lot. And so I gotta ask you guys, I'm putting this one out there to the Y2K crew. Did you notice that? And this is the elephant in the room. Did you notice that your hood friends had Sega Genesis and your preppy friends had Super Nintendo? Now, back in the day, before the era of Best Buy, there were a wide variety of electronic stores that you could go to and buy games and consoles from. You had Toys R Us, you had Nobody Beats the Wiz, you had Radio Shack, you had Circuit City, you had PC Richard and Son, you had all of the small mom and pop electronic stores that were around all around New York. So there was a ton of ways that you could have bought video games. And the thing was that the Sega Genesis was always the first to roll their prices back. I remember we used to get the flyer, we used to get the newspaper, the Sega Genesis, soon they dropped their price down to $99.99. Then they dropped it to $89.99, $79.99, $69.99, $59 until it got down to $49.99 for a brand new Sega Genesis. And I don't ever remember the Super Nintendo discounting Nintendo discounting the Super Nintendo that much. Now, I might be wrong, but you guys can let me know down in the comments. I don't ever remember Nintendo selling themselves short. And I felt like the Super Nintendo was always just an expensive console. Now, the Sega Genesis had a bunch of attachments, but whenever Nintendo came out with an add-on, it just seemed so much more premium, like the Super Scope. If you had a Super Scope as a kid, oh, you were rich. As a kid, let me know down in the comments if you know what I'm talking about. But as a kid, if you had a classmate who had a Super Scope, you immediately thought that kid was rich. You were like, oh yeah, this kid's rich. He has a Super Scope. Like, there's no way you cannot be rich and have a Super Scope. And I just remembered, if you were a kid back in the 90s and your parents let you choose which system you wanted, most kids picked the Super Nintendo. Most kids actually wanted a Super Nintendo. But if your parents never gave you a choice and they said you're just going to take whatever system you get, their parents were probably going to buy you a Sega Genesis because it was the cheaper system to buy and the games were probably cheaper to get. Now me, as a kid, I got neither option. What I got as a kid were the little Tiger Electronics games because my parents weren't spending any kind of money on any video games for me. So I got very accustomed to playing Tiger Electronics. And it was actually pretty sad because by the time the Game Boy came out, kids were coming around with their Game Boys and I was still playing these lame Tiger Electronics games. But I'm interested to know your thoughts. Do you think that the Sega was a hood system and the Nintendo was more preppy? Or do you think that it just didn't matter and it just came down to choice? I'm interested to know your thoughts on this. It's definitely been an elephant in the room for a long time, and I'm here to finally squash the perception. Let me know down in the comments. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.